Well, hello. I haven't done a video on here for a very long time, um, and I feel a bit guilty about it. But anyway, I didn't really have that much I wanted to talk about, uh, but now I have. So I thought I'd do a new video. Basically, I recently, well, fairly recently, wrote some songs. They're settings of poems by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is one of my favourite English poets. And I entitled this collection of 8 songs, Late Lyrics. Now, Late Lyrics is the title of one of Thomas Hardy's later collections of poetry. And I thought it would make a good title for my collection of musical settings, partly because they are mostly late poems of Hardy, but also I felt that they're probably the last song settings that I'm likely to do. So Late Lyrics seemed rather appropriate. Anyway, there you are, Thomas Hardy. Why do I like Thomas Hardy? He's a very interesting, fascinating figure. Very odd and perverse in some ways. He had a rather bleak outlook on life, I suppose. One person I know called him a miserable old sod, which is not much of a compliment for one of Britain's greatest writers. But anyway, I think that's going a bit too far. You know, he did go a bit over the top, as in his last novel, Jude the Obscure, which really, I mean, it's just one of the most depressing novels you could ever read. It got such a bad reputation that after that he just concentrated on writing poetry, which he was very good at, actually. And the last 30 years or so of his life was entirely devoted to poetry. He was an odd character. He didn't believe in God. He believed in a sort of impersonal life force that drove everything in the universe, and he called it the immanent will. And it was a force that drove everything, but it was not conscious in itself, and it wasn't interested in human beings at all. So basically, if you got in its way, you'd just be crushed. And that was his view of life, really. It was in common, other people at the time, George Bernard Shaw and others, believed in this sort of idea. And it gives a certain kind of view of the world. Whether you like it or not, whether you find it sympathetic or not, is a matter of personal taste, I suppose. I find it sympathetic up to a certain point. Anyway, it's not all gloom and doom. I mean, his poetry, what I like about his poetry is it has this wonderful, first of all, it has this wonderful sense of country life in Wessex, in the part of the world that he grew up in and lived most of his life in. And the humorous side of it, the quaint side of it, country customs and traditions, all that kind of thing comes into it. Sometimes his poems are quite humorous. I set one of them in this group of settings called Only One Cuckoo, which is quite an amusing one. But some of them are a bit sad, some of them are a bit portentous. And also, in particular, he had this wonderful feeling for nature. There's a particularly famous poem of his called Proud Songsters, which is all about birds singing and how those birds are singing away like mad. A year or two ago were just nothing at all. They were just particles of earth and air and rain, as he put it. And the thing that makes his late poetry interesting is that he was a very, very difficult person, I think, in many ways. He had 2 wives. His first wife, Emma, he met when they were both quite young. They met in Cornwall, and it was all terribly romantic. It was a kind of whirlwind romance. But sadly, as the years went by after their marriage, they moved apart. And by the end of the marriage, they were living in the same house, but they were living separate lives. They were just completely estranged from one another. But then she died. And the extraordinary thing is that once she died, Hardy suddenly seemed to remember how he'd felt about her all those years ago. And he started writing a series of some of his most beautiful poems, which are largely about nostalgia, about remembering those days of youth and love and hope and all the rest of it. And they're very, very poignant. The poem I'm introducing today is one of those. It's called If It's Ever Spring Again. And it's a sort of memory of presumably of meeting Emma in his early days of courtship in the spring, or hoping for the spring anyway. And it's very touching. I have here my collected poems of Thomas Hardy, which I've had since 1973. Goodness me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the poem, and then below this video I will put a link to the recording, which is on SoundCloud. And the recording is by Javin Raj baritone and Anthony Gray piano. And I hope you'll listen to the recording, and if you like it, I'd be very pleased if you made some kind of comment on it, and also recommend it to other people. But here we are. This is the poem, If It's Ever Spring Again. If it's ever spring again, I shall go where went I when down the moorcock splashed and hen, seeing me not amid their flounder, standing with my arm around her. If it's ever spring again, I shall go where went I then. If it's ever summertime, with the hay crop at the prime, and the cuckoos too, in rhyme, as they used to be, or seemed to, we shall do as long we dream to. If it's ever summertime, with the hay and bees a chime.